I'm the best ever. I'm the most brutal and vicious and most ruthless champion there's ever been. There's no one can stop me.
Welcome, boxing fans, to another installment of Corner to Corner Boxing. As you can see, we have a pair of great guests here today. We have Mr. Robert Benavides and Stephen Debro, director and producer, or I should say producer and director of the Emmy-nominated documentary 18th and Grand, the Olympic Auditorium story. Thank you guys for joining us.
Right on, thanks for having us.
Happy to be here.
Thank you. So, as we were preparing for this interview, I saw the film and absolutely loved it. What it felt like to me was like if a bunch of friends, like old school friends, just got together and they found like a yearbook that they had not seen for many years, and then you just have this amazing time with amazing friends and just have an amazing time telling stories that have maybe not been forgotten, but definitely not been told in a way. And when you see it visually, it just adds a different element to it. That's how I lived your documentary. So with that said, Stephen, as a director, if you can tell us a little bit about yourself, how did this wonderful project come to be?
Well, the Olympic Auditorium was sort of lodged deep in my memories as an Angelino, because growing up, it was always on television. So whether it was boxing or wrestling or roller derby, the Olympic was just a part of my childhood. And so many people who grew up in LA, it's like a collective memory. So, and some of my first heroes were like, and villains, were experienced watching that on the Olympic, whether it was, roller derby, boxing, or wrestling. So that was deep in my mind. And then a friend of mine turned me on to the photography of Theo Arrett. And Theo Arrett was the house photographer at the Olympic Auditorium from the mid-1960s till around 1980, early 80s. And those pictures just took me back. So this was years later. I mean, the Olympic, basically, as the film kind of shows, kind of died out in terms of being a regular force on television in the early 80s. So it was years later when these photos were shown to me, and then it triggered a lot of memories, it triggered a lot of fascination with the story, and I was sort of going down a rabbit hole. And it took a long time. It's been a long process, and what I did realize pretty quickly was that, number one, it was a story worth telling because it touched upon a collective history of Los Angeles, the history of the sports themselves, of boxing, wrestling, roller derby, and music, and all the other things that happen at the venue. And that if we didn't record the story soon, the story couldn't be told, because a lot of the folks were aging rapidly, and so that was the birth of it. And it went through a long process to get started, and a lot of different permutations and different people who were involved and then fell out of it and all sorts of stuff. But along the way I met Rob at a Theo Arrett show that we were doing a photo exhibition, and Rob came to see it, and we just started talking, and Rob told me about his history in film, which is pretty significant, and I was really happy when he agreed to join the small team that had started this project. So Rob joined pretty early on.
Well, thank you for sharing that, and we're also happy that Rob joined the team. We know how much you bring to the table. If you can actually tell our listeners and our viewers what your background is and your role in the film.
Yeah, well, my name is Robert Benavides again. I go by Rob, everybody calls me Rob. And primarily I'm a cinematographer, I'm a director of photography, working in motion pictures and commercials and music videos. I had a big background in hip so I did a lot of, work in rap videos, like with Cypress Hill and Noriega, DMX, a lot of, stuff in the 90s, and I produced and shot the Tribe Called Quest, the documentary about the rap group of Tribe Called Quest, and then most recently I had something on Hulu, which you can still see, which is a series called Hip Hop Uncovered. It's a 6-part series on sort of the behind the scenes in music and street life and stuff. So, but I've always loved boxing. I started watching boxing in the early 90s, and I moved to LA. I grew up in Chicago, and I moved to LA in 96, and always have just had passion. It's the only sport I follow. I'm not like an expert, but I've seen a lot of fights, and I've gone to fights, and I follow the sport. And yeah, I think as I get older, I started to help produce and put together some things, and like Steve said, sort of kismet. I saw this photo show that he had presented of Theo Errett, and we met there, and then he was like, I'm thinking about doing a documentary, and then we just started chatting. So yeah, so I have that cinema background, and when he said he was going to do this, we talked about it a lot, and and I was happy to be a part of it, and like you said, we got nominated for an Emmy, and it's really been a labor of love. Nobody got paid, doing this, and who knows if we'll ever, but it doesn't matter, man, because it's like I always say, these documentaries are, they're historical documents. They're literally like, as if you, and as if you were to put a time capsule, buried in the ground. But now now it's all over the world, and hopefully more and more people will see it. And with exposure like this, we appreciate it, So yeah, it's been a cool road, man.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
I've seen it about 6 times now.
Oh wow!
I just can't get enough of it.
Oh wow!
I grew up a mile away from the Olympic. I grew up on 24th and San Pedro, and when we would drive home after school, I would get off on the 10 West or the 10 East on Maple. So I would pass it every single day, and it's just I as an Angelino and somebody that grew up next to it, I just want to say thank you guys, because it is, you said it. It's one of those stories that was on the verge of never being told, because you have all these figures that were there, and
That's right.
They were aging, and you get to
Yeah. Thank you, bro. Yeah, it's a trip. It reawakens a lot of things, right? The fascinating thing is how many people drive by that place and they have no idea. And all the seats are still in there. It's like Steve can talk about it, but we almost did a fight with Golden Boy there once years ago. We toured it, and right, for like a benefit for homeless something. But yeah, I'm glad. Yeah, it's definitely been a forgotten place. Yeah.
Was this fight or this potential fight after it became a church?
Yes. We were talking with the church about it and engaged in some discussions, and they were open to it until they weren't.
Okay.
So they have the church. I've tried to be really respectful with them, and generally they've been respectful with me, though they have we'll just put it this way, both their membership and their clergy and their leadership have mixed feelings about its history. While some view it as, we're part of that history, others would like to erase that history. And so I would say it's complex. So I never diss them. I'm always trying to be respectful of them, and generally speaking, they are of me. But it's like I pitched to them that, like, look, without you guys, that place probably would have been torn down. It would have been like a big box retailer or apartment complex or whatever, and parking, whatever it is. It's a 6-acre site in downtown LA, so it's a valuable piece of real estate. And the fact that they exist and the fact they're a church has allowed the building to still be there. So for that, I give them, all due respect and props for that. Maybe one day,
right?
It leaves open the possibility that maybe one day it could return. Once it gets torn down, then that is precluded. So if it's being used for a church, at least it's basically the same as when it closed as the Grand Olympic Auditorium in 2005 inside it, with the exception that the pulpit's in there. It's been, it's the same light grade that existed over the ring is still there. Yeah. So, and this upstairs is the same, so in many ways it resembles the building that it was when it was shut down years ago. So, all that I guess is a long way of saying the battle to make the film has been really interesting, and the relationships that have developed out of it have been really rich and interesting, and kind of it's like peeling an onion, and the city is like that onion, and so you peel one thing and you see like, oh, here's this community, and they feel kinship to it. A lot of people in neighborhoods and people feel this sort of a sense of ownership and pride over the building, and which is cool, and it is like, that's the thing. What interests me too is, besides the sport aspect of it, is just how it related to the city on so many levels, and that's what the film tries to do, is just like give you a sense over time what was happening in the city, and then how the Olympic related to it, and how the battles that took place within the Olympic were kind of stand-ins for the battles that were happening in other ways in the city. And so that's the interesting sort of subtextual level, besides the great fighters and the great wrestlers and all that stuff that is sort of beneath the surface, that is kind of interesting to me.
Yeah, that's great context. And if you can tell us a little bit about just how long it took to this process, because when I saw the premiere, and I made a comment. I kind of meant it a little bit as a joke, but it's actually true. I told you that you were able to keep my son, who's 13 years old, entertained, right? Because he lives in the world of, and sometimes I'm guilty of it too, right? I create a reel, I publish it on Instagram, and I'm gonna write my credits on IMDb or something during it, because I feel like it was something that took me a while. But when you compare that to what you actually did and the time it took and the effort, if you could tell our viewers, our listeners about the journey, I think it would be great.
Yes, I'm happy to do that, because it really was, and I owe a lot of credit to Rob. And one of the reasons I brought Rob, like when we connected, and I really wanted Rob to be part of it, was like I wanted a real filmmaker to help me as a first-time filmmaker make sure that it was up to snuff, that it was like a real movie. Because I was like, if I'm gonna do it, I realized, because at first it kind of started as an oral history project, which was like, I better get these stories down or these people will be dead. Yeah. And so then, as I started doing it, it was like, wow, these are amazing stories, and the people, it's not just a series of interviews, this is a narrative, this is a story. And so it was really important to me to bring people in, and Rob being the number one person who had the experience, who understood what it was like to make a real movie. It was fascinating, and it was really such a learning experience to have found along the way people, some with a lot of experience, some with not that much experience, who felt the same, who became this little team, this little family of people who got behind it and provided their expertise to it. So it's my movie, but it's all of our movies. I mean, Rob, Tony Peck, who was my cousin, who was a shooter, a cinematographer, who was, I was like, hey man, would you be interested in doing this? And he works a lot of, industrial jobs and things that aren't the most exciting things to him, but it's his living. And so he was excited to do it. And, he's 3 months younger than me, so we grew up together. So he was someone I could count on.
Yeah.
And then
he had the gear too.
And he
That
had
was
the
like-
gear.
So when did we, like 2015?
2014, we shot the first interviews.
Yeah, it's been a while. So, you know, like anything, sometimes, I mean, there's films that take 10, 15
Yeah.
years, you know, but like you're doing this with nothing,
Yeah.
with no money at the beginning. And so it's, you know, he had Tony, and he was like, hey, my cousin's got the camera, you know, he had everything, because the sound equipment, everything. And so we just started going out little by little, setting up interviews. I think you guys had maybe done a couple interviews before I even. You had sort of started it. Or maybe
We
started a little.
We started the oral history part of it. Really, we had interviewed. I
yeah.
think LeBell, rest in peace,
Rest in peace,
passed away
LeBell.
recently, and Gene.
Literally the first MMA artist.
Yeah.
He was
I don't follow MMA, but I have a friend who's hardcore, and he's like, that's the first MMA.
Yeah.
He fought what was considered the first MMA fight against
Right.
a boxer named Mando Ramos. Exactly.
I mean, he trained Chuck Norris.
He
Oh,
trained
yeah,
Chuck-
man,
He
yeah.
trained,
A lot of
he
people,
trained
that's right.
Bruce Lee. He trained
Yeah.
all sorts of people. So he's.
So
There was
he was
no
one-
one, yeah, he was, and there was no one like Gene. And so when I went to Gene, it's a funny story. The first time I went to Gene to kind of get his,
Blessing.
get his blessing and get him on board. So I go to he lived in a condo in Van Nuys, went to the place, and he's talking to me, and he's friendly and everything, but I know Gene has a reputation of being a little bit, let's say, eccentric.
Yes.
So I'm there and I'm talking to him, and he goes behind me, and I'm like just sort of talking, and all of a sudden I've got a nightstick, a wrap on my throat,
Oh,
and he's tightening it around my throat, and I'm like, haha, Gene, that's funny, and it's just like, and he keeps tightening it up, and I'm like, Gene, that's really funny, but and it keeps, I'm like, Gene, please stop. And then all of a sudden it's gone, and he's like, it's gone, and he's sitting in the chair in front of me. I'm like,
Whoa.
ooh,
What
Gene wants to remind you at any time that he could do whatever he wants. So that was like, it's a lesson that Gene, and I didn't flinch too much. I did submit. I didn't fight him, and why would I have? And I think from that point on, we were cool. And he, I think there's certainly in wrestling, there's definitely, and I learned this later with Roddy Piper, there is a rite of passage. There's a amount of respect. There's kind of hazing almost that people will put you through. And so, anyway, to cut a long story short, Gene opened a lot of doors for me. So Gene started the ball rolling, connected me with Don Chargin. He was like, you have to talk to Don Chargin.
Right.
And Don Chargin, was the greatest.
Yes.
I mean, Don was one of the greatest matchmakers, one of the greatest promoters and matchmakers in the history of boxing. He did it for more years than anybody, starting back in the 40s. Manuel Ortiz, I think, was his first fight, one of the greatest of all time. Greatest bantamweights ever, the start of the 1940s, and he was working with Golden Boy till the very end when he passed away a few years ago. So he was, and he was super generous. And people, once they know you're sincere, they know that you come prepared, that you have come respectfully prepared, and you have an open mind, and you're not trying to say you know everything. It goes a long way.
Absolutely.
It goes a long way. And so when we came and we set up and we did it and we made people look good and we cared and we followed up and we stayed in touch, all of those things, and then the way the strategy was for me, it was you get someone and when people talk amongst each other, hey, they were cool, they were good, they came prepared, then the next person, you can go check with so-and-so, talk to Don, talk to Gene, and then they say something good about you, talk to them, trust these guys, and then that gradually, and built and built.
Yeah, and then we just kept doing more interviews, and then he did a Kickstarter, just in encapsulating how he got here kind of thing. He did a Kickstarter, it's been a long road, he got some money, then you got a little investor, and it's still, and now we're on Amazon, which is great, and we'll talk about the museum show as well, but yeah, man, it's been a labor of love, it's been a real labor of love.
It is. It's been a labor of love and a journey of just learning so much. That's been, to me, I love to learn new things.
Yeah.
I mean, that to me is like one of the things that, keeps your mind active, is like to never be complacent in that sense of like feeling like you know it all or whatever. It's like, give me something new to learn.
Yeah.
And if it's interesting, I'm all in. And so learning to make the film was really fascinating, and bringing in smart people who had experience like Rob, and then our editor Shane McClafferty,
great.
Man, killer editor. And so he was, it was so interesting looking for an editor. Someone said to me like, there's a lot of editors out there, and it's like, it may be something about them that isn't what is the obvious thing about them that is what might be good. And Shane is a drummer, and his sense of time and music, and I'm a music guy, and music helped drive the film. And so to get someone who like had that feel, like Shane he's a feel editor, and then the story side, then Mary McAnulty came along through another weird, just sort of strange coincidence, and she started out just scanning things for me, and then ended up being a producer because she was so adept and could do everything from story edit with me to all the technical stuff. She taught herself how to edit during the process. She's one of those people who's just like brilliant in that way. So this little ragtag team, all of them were very talented, but would never have come together otherwise. Really, I don't know if I just said too much, but that's how if you want to know the nuts and bolts of how this film came together, it was will and happenstance.
The reason why I wanted to bring this up is because you describe it as a labor of love. Rob, I've seen you describe it as a love story to Los Angeles. And I wanted, the goal of this interview is I want everyone who watches this interview, everyone who hears this interview, you have to watch this film. It's absolutely mandatory. You love boxing, you love LA, if you love film, if you love music, there's something for everyone in this film. So with that in mind, the favorite thing about this movie, at least for me, is the connections, the amount of connections that they just go on one after another. You mentioned Gene LeBell. You mentioned how he was essentially in 1963 the first sanctioned MMA fight in the US. Gene LeBell was later a referee for another famous crossover event between, maybe our listeners have heard of the name Muhammad Ali. He was the referee for Muhammad Ali versus Antonio Inoki in Japan. And there's so many, that's just one connection. There's so many connections in this film. So while we talk about the film, we want to be respectful. We don't want to do spoilers. We want everyone who watches the film to see it for the first time. Luckily for us, like we just said, there's so many things that we can talk about that can drive people to watch the film without really getting so much into the film.
Right.
So, for context, while we were prepping for this conversation with you guys, Carlos and I agreed that we had to do a good job, or it was like disrespect to Los Angeles. Like, that's how much we love this movie and love the message. And one of the things that you mentioned about talking to these different people was the importance of being sincere and really wanting to understand. And like I said, I've watched this movie about 5 or 6 times. And what's come across when you're talking to these people, they're not interviews. These people are really giving you their life story. And they're letting you in on the secret that they were all kind of part of. You mentioned Gene, and one of the central figures of the movie was Gene's mom.
Yes.
A very important figure in Los Angeles history, but that is on the verge of being forgotten, right? Because a lot of those people are being aged out. So again, without giving too much away from the documentary, tell me a little bit about Aileen Eaton and what drew you to her story.
Oh, well, that was really, when Gene knew that, like, to me, Aileen was so important and so just such an unusual person. I was like, it just struck me, you know, how did she do it? I mean, like, because, you know, 1942, okay, we're in the middle of World War II. She had never been to a fight before. She was divorced with 2 children, and then her husband dies. Anyway, she really just fascinated me. She fascinated me, and I felt like her story had to be told. And so peeling the onion was like one of the central parts. Was like, who was this person? How did she do it? What was it about her? And to try to talk to as many people as I could who actually knew her, who had experienced working with her, and what was the commonalities and what was her personal life like. And I would have long conversations with Gene on the phone and with Don Chargin and with others about, tell me about Aileen, like what was she like? And so, and the film, I mean, honestly, just scratches the surface, really. And we
discovered it during the making, right? Like, I mean, so we set out to make this film, and that's how, like, you talk about the onion, it's like, then he learned, like, oh wait, Aileen ran this whole place. Like, this woman in a man's world ran this whole place, and then that became even more of a central part of the story, you know what I mean? So it's sort of like you can't find these things out until you start getting started, and that's sort of part of the documentary process. Is sometimes you don't really, you know, you have an idea about something, but you have to be ready to shift and go, oh wow, there's this, you know, and that became such an important part of the film, you know. And so I think, you know, like her and so many other of these people, I mean, if you see at the end, you know, a lot of people passed away, you know, and will continue to pass away. So I think it's great that we got these people on film before they went, you know. But yeah, it was a really interesting discovery. The way, you know.
There were all sorts of mysteries along the way that just came, and that's the beauty also, just like I read about LA history going back to the 1800s. I dug so deep into this. I was in public documents, I was in building plans, I was into everything, because as you said, wanting to respect the story, wanting to respect, you know, like, who was the guy who built the Olympic? Who was the guy behind it? Well, it turns out it was a guy named Jake Danziger, who was the partner of Edward Doheny, who was at one point the richest man in the world, who discovered oil in Los Angeles and then oil in Mexico, and was incredibly wealthy, and was brought down by the Teapot Dome scandal of all things, which you might have heard about in your, you know, in history school, in history class. So all of that, just, you know, you don't see it in the movie, but that forms the understanding behind the movie, and I think it gives it the depth, because if you by understanding how those pieces fit together, and you know that this is a building that was built by the elites of the city for the 1932 Olympics, when LA was this up and coming town that wanted to be on par with the great cities of the world, because it was growing so rapidly, and this building was part of the plan to do that. It was built by elites, but then it became the people's venue. And that, to me, was such a cool process. That was like, you know, and then all the boxing clubs and wrestling clubs, which I learned along the way, that were so active, you know, at one point in time, like, there were multiple arenas. You could see a fight almost every night of the week at a different club across the city. And the last one left standing was the Olympic in the late, you know, all the other ones died out by the late 50s, and the Olympic was left standing. And that was in many parts due to Aileen. Because Aileen lived, breathed, and died the Olympic Auditorium. She gave her life to the place. So again, going to the whole thing of like respect. Like, I respected the people's time, like, who gave their stories. It was like, I watched, you know, I watched Masterclass with Werner Herzog, the filmmaker, the documentarian and filmmaker, and one thing he was like, you cannot not finish. That is the only thing, the only rule is you cannot not finish.
Thank you for giving us a little glimpse into the amazing story of Aileen Eaton. One of our listeners, as we were prepping for this conversation, for this interview, we sent this out to a few of our listeners and we said, hey, check this out. You have to check it out. And they came back and they actually pointed an interesting parallel between another LA legend and Aileen Eaton, Mitzi Shore. So they just felt it was interesting how Mitzi Shore is just another iconic LA legend, a woman that dominated in a field that's mostly dominated by men. And they were wondering if they ever crossed paths, if you know, they ever had any type of connection, any type of relationship.
It could have been. I mean, I don't know. I mean, Aileen was so siloed in a sense. I mean, that's not true. She was very involved in politics.
Okay.
And she liked to throw her weight around politically. So it's possible that they met. I mean, there were a handful of women who were like Roz Wyman, who helped get Dodger Stadium built, to some people's happiness and to others' dismay, because of what happened in the building of Dodger Stadium. But there were a handful of, powerful women who operated, and there were powerful politicians as well. And Aileen tried to become a politician. She ran for office in 1958, which isn't in the film, other than we have a little sort of slide of that in the film. But she ran in Hancock Park, didn't win, and came back to the Olympic Auditorium. But I don't know if she ever met Mitzi, but it's possible she could have.
That's a great question. Yeah.
Okay. Then that came to us from one of our listeners, Javier Ramirez Photography on Instagram. So thank you for the great question. We appreciate it. Yeah. So before we talked about how we live in this new digital age, in this new age of media where we have 1-minute reels, 30-second reels, and I love some of them. Some of my favorite content to consume. There's a gentleman that does LA in a minute, and I love that guy.
That's great.
It reminds me of Evan.
Yeah.
He reminds me a little bit of the concept of California Gold with Hugh
That's
Hauser.
right, that's right.
And he kind of just picked that up.
That's right.
We're in combat, so combat sports. Cabra Combat is another one that I love to consume.
Yes.
Small type of
Sebastian.
reels.
Sebastian.
Yeah, Sebastian. He's great.
Yep. Yeah.
So, but there's also this, and it's not just in really film. It's not just in like social media. It's in other industries as well, in music. Right before you used to do, concept albums and things like that. But now it's like streaming. So you do one song or something like that. So if you can talk a little bit about maybe the difference between doing a long project like this and maybe something more short-lived, because I think there's a lot of importance in that.
Well, it felt like it had the scope of a film, and it almost even felt like for a long time I talked with Rob about it being like a docu-series, because there was so much, and there's so much that we left out. I mean, we did 50 long-form 4K interviews, so we have this incredible historic record, and there's so much more material that we could make, and so and going to the question of people revealing their stories in these intimate conversations, and some of those things do fit. They're beautiful short bits, and then there's much longer kind of, like Carlos Palomino, for example, his story, in which we were able to get Carlos is a pretty important part of the film, and we got some of the emotional stuff, but it's so deep, and it's hard to hard to narrow it. But anyway,
the mechanics of it too are like, you could do how Evan does that social media, and like that's what's exciting, that there is those avenues, but like this kind of project where like it needs to be a film, because we were doing it, financing it on our own, and so it's like you don't have like somebody, we didn't have Netflix or anybody, we tried to approach some places later on, to finance something like a series, that takes, it's a little bit more organization, and you need to have like some bank for that, because you're stopping and starting, and it's a different animal. Whereas with a film, we knew we can have a film make that the anchor, and then everything could go on from there. Like like Steve said, there's so much footage. That's what's so cool about the film is that it's he always called it the auditorium, the Olympic Auditorium project is like the shell of it, you know, where it can shoot off to different things, you know, because you have so many different subcultures. But it had to be a film first, I think. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
As an independent production, the film is something that you can take as one whole piece. Because we are in this attention deficit, you know, society, you know, unfortunately, little small things are good, but if you have a big piece, it can kind of be the anchor. And I wanted to remark on what you had said when you came to the screening, the American Cinematheque screening, about that really struck me. You know, you stood up and you said, you know, you're here with your 13-year-old son. Your 13-year-old son watches TikTok, and this film kept his attention. And I think that was part of our goal, like having Shane, our editor, you know, and the style of the film. You know, I've had people go, man, that movie moves and moves and moves, because, you know, let's face it, it's a lot of like older people in the film, you know what I mean? And you have a new generation, and I think we did a great job that, you know, and that can make it accessible to all age groups, you know.
That was really important to us along the way. It was like, you know, the film had to work the way I felt it had multiple needs. It had to work for the people who went and were part of it, for it to feel correct and authentic to them. We had to honor each of the subcultures and sports that were a part of it. And we also had a duty to try to tell the story to a younger generation.
Right.
Because talking to, I mean, as Rob and I both know, like, you know, you go to, say, these boxing reunions, and it's wonderful, and it's really warm, and people love it, and they go, but it's getting older and older, this crowd, and it won't last forever. Right. And so we wanted to do a film where younger people, and it has been very gratifying that teenagers and young women and different kind of people are really, like, it's working. It's resonating that way. Yeah. And so it has to continue on. The point of this is not to make something for the same old people. It was to do that, but it was also, if you never knew about the Olympic Auditorium, we wanted someone to have a film. I turned this on, and wow, I didn't think I was going to like it, but wow, I loved it. And that was of major importance to both of us, that this worked in that way.
And you're absolutely right, because it appeals to different generations. To jump into the film, I'll give you an example. I'm from the generation where a huge important fight to us was Julio Cesar Chavez and Oscar de la Hoya. That was symbolic in many different ways. You had the Mexican, you had the Chicano, you had the Golden Boy, and they were fighting really to determine who's the best, who's gonna earn that love of the Mexican people, right? And till this day, Oscar says, hey, that's the fight that gives me the most division, the most tension. And watching the film, I won't spoil who the fighters are, but there's a fight there that reminds me of that dynamic. There's a if you see the film, you'll understand and you'll appreciate fights like Chavez and De La Hoya, because there's history behind it. And that's one of the things that I loved about the film.
Yeah, there was trailblazing there way before these guys even met.
Yeah, and then, I think that tension, that's the cool thing about that, is that, yes, that's been an undercurrent forever of Mexicans and Chicanos, and those battles playing themselves out at the ring at the Olympic was a theme. And not in the film is Frankie Duarte, who's from Venice, California. He's in the film just for a second. But Frankie said, he'd fight against a Mexican at the Olympic, and he'd get booed as the Chicano from Venice. He's like, "What? I'm not Mexican. I'm Mexican." And he got upset about it because he didn't. The fans. In LA, a lot of times it was the Mexican that got the love, not the Chicano. Yeah. So that dynamic is like it's a part of the culture, and And
But yeah,
it speaks to something deeper, you know.
I mean, you see, and it's not a spoiler. I mean, you're referencing Aragon. I mean, who was the original Golden Boy, and that's the genesis. And there's a lot of things that started at the Olympics like that. But that's a great pickup for sure. Definitely.
Thank you.
The parallel. Yeah.
I saw a quote by Don Chargin, a legendary promoter, that mentioned his primary go-to to make a big event was to match up a local Chicano fighter against a good Mexican fighter. And what he would do is he would send thousands of tickets down to Mexico. This was in the 70s. And to cross the border, folks would just come, get to the border, show their ticket, and they'd get a 72-hour pass. They didn't even have to show their passport.
Yeah, it was a different border, and there was a lot more fluidity at the time, and people would come for the weekend, they'd see their family or whatever, party, go to the fight, and come back on the weekend. And you know, I wish those days were still around.
And boxing just had more of a respect.
The draw.
Yeah. Imagine saying, "Hey, I'm gonna go see a Canelo fight in Vegas. Here's my ticket.
Yeah,
you don't need a passport." Like that. You're right. It's a different border, but it's also a different respect and love for the sport that I think we have today. I think in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, boxing was probably the biggest sport in the U.S.
Baseball, boxing.
Baseball, one of the two.
Right.
Yeah.
Where do you guys see the sport today compared to?
It's a better question.
I mean, I love the sport. I mean, it's sort of like, where do I see it today? I think it's, it's business. It's a lot. Business has kind of taken over, I mean, what did we just see recently? Was Frank Martin pulled out of the fight with Shakur Stevenson, so, I think you hear, Steve Kim talk about it a lot too, like, I mean, and I'm sure you guys have spoken about it too, where it's like these, people used to fight like 5-6 times a year, and like now people fight once a year, so, what are you gonna do? I don't know, you know what I mean? I'm not a promoter, I don't know, but I think, a long answer is that I think the sport is strong. I think women's boxing is really exciting right now. I'm excited about women's boxing, and I'm also excited about some of the younger fighters that are from LA. We've got the Olympics coming up eventually in LA, which will be exciting, and there's a lot of female fighters coming up. But I think it's different. I think it's a big business, but I think it's actually kind of coming back. There was a lull for me anyways the last few years, and there's a uptick, but it's different now. It's not like it's become a business, and with social media, it's like how many followers you have. It's like a popularity contest, and you're seeing fighters just talk about it like that, and
Yeah, that's a great point. While we were looking into researching for this conversation, we came across Aileen's counterpart, who was the matchmaker and promoter at the forum. And there was a quote that stood out. Now, I'm going to paraphrase it because I'll butcher it if I try to quote him. But essentially, he says, it's not about making the most money as a promoter. It's about being the best promoter and putting on the best fights. And I think that encompasses, what the goal was back then when putting on boxing events to what you just described as, what it is today.
Yeah. I mean, that was Don Chargin's thing. That's why that journalist nicknamed him War a Week, because every week Don War a Week Chargin would put on a battle every week. I mean, she was throwing a fight every week.
Every week. I mean, it's amazing thing. Every Thursday night for decades.
It's crazy.
At a 10,000 seat arena is quite remarkable.
Yeah.
And I think you were talking about George Parnassus.
Yes.
And George Parnassus was an amazing promoter, and he and Aileen were kind of frenemies. I think of them because they worked together. They both got their starts around the same time and came up. Parnassus was Enrique Bolaños' manager, and Aileen was the business manager at the Olympic, and really was kind of doing everything. But even though her husband was the face promoter, so they for the fans, I mean, think about the 60s and 70s in LA, when you had the Forum and the Olympic going at the same time. The Forum specialized in Mexicans fighting Mexicans. The Olympic specialized in Mexican Americans fighting Mexicans. Right. And in both cases, for the fans, it was a real winner. You Ruben Olivares sold out the Forum. He never fought at the Olympic. He fought for Parnassus, and he sold out the Forum numerous times. So you had a great. So for fans, I would say the old days were better.
Yeah.
Because maybe for fighters, it's better for their, they get hit less, they fight less. Maybe for their long term, make more money per fight. So the leverage has shifted somewhat. But for the fans, I have to say, I would think that, going to the days of the Olympic where you could pay a reasonable amount of money, see a good fight, and they did care about, Don, one of the things that Don Chargin said was like, we respected, we had to respect, and Aileen said, we had to respect our fans because they knew more than we did. And the fans were like there every week, so you couldn't put it over on them. You had to get good matches or they wouldn't keep coming.
Right.
And so there was a sense of like, hey, we got to give fans their money's worth, and so it's a good question, and it's times have changed, as Rob said. It's mirrored society in many ways, but I would guess that if you were a regular fight goer back in the old days, you had more on your menu that you could see on a weekly basis that was strong.
So obviously the Olympic is a relic of LA, and it's it was one of the monuments of the city. Where would you rate the Olympic during the 60s and 70s on a global scale for boxing? Because to your point, those Thursday night fights, they were also on Channel 5, and then they transitioned to a nationally syndicated sports show that was also internationally.
Yeah, Rick Ferris, the historian, makes the case in the film that that the Olympic and Aileen at that point were the most important promoters in the United States, if not the world, in the 1960s and 70s. That to put on a weekly boxing card and build fighters, they were really active in the community and had tentacles all through Southern California and in New Mexico looking for talent and people feeding it into the Olympic. And Aileen was a great, she was a great promoter in terms of like Carlos Palomino talks about, how she built his career up and the details of how they maneuvered him into that spot.
Right.
I leave it to the historians. I can't say that for sure that the Olympic was the most important place.
It was one of them, it's just the mechanics of it. It's a 10,400 seat arena in one of the biggest cities in America, in what would, say a big cultural draw for the world. So I'd say it's pretty important.
Yeah.
And then you add in the movies that were shot there at the same time, you kind of go like, well, so if you add Raging Bull and you add Rocky, you go like, well, okay, in terms of having resonance around the world and like giving the idea of this is what boxing is supposed to look like in popular culture, the Olympic. So I guess I'm a homer, but I would say the Olympic.
Yeah. So I'll tell you a story, and I almost did cartwheels when I learned this. So I was fortunate enough to go to some fights at the Olympic. I was probably a freshman or a sophomore in high school, and all my uncles and cousins, we would go to these fights put on. I think they were by Golden Boy.
Right.
They were smaller fights, but they were fun. They were down the street, a mile away. We could walk there, and there was this one event where Sylvester Stallone walks out, and we're towards the top of the seats, but the whole crowd starts going, Rocky, Rocky, and I'm like fully into it. I have goosebumps because it's one of my favorite movies, right? And just the energy of the crowd, it felt like they were really cheering for Rocky. Later on, I learned that Rocky was filmed there, so you really had a crowd cheering for Rocky in the venue where he fought Apollo Creed.
Yeah.
If you ever want to, on YouTube, there are scenes of the training at the Olympic with Stallone and Carl Weathers.
Really?
Yeah. So check out. It's on YouTube, and it's kind of a great, cool thing. You see the Olympic seats in the background. It's the Olympics.
That's crazy.
And we have some cool stills of them training there. They also shot at the sports arena too.
Yeah.
But yeah, they shot a few of the Rockies there. Not all the movie because they shot in different parts. But it's funny because Steve mentions it. I can't remember the name of it, but on a flight on United once, they had like a 20-minute documentary, and it's about the making of Rocky. And I kept seeing the Olympic, and I was freaking out. I was like, oh my God, like this, we tried to get Sylvester, but it didn't work out. But maybe the good thing about this project is that, like I said, it's tentacles, and there'll be other offshoots. So I'm hoping some of the people that were not able to join us last time could maybe join us for smaller sections that we'll do.
Or come to the exhibition, because the exhibition is really like another way for people to experience the Olympic in a different way.
Yeah. It's forgive the cliche expression, but it felt like the perfect 1-2 punch for me. When I saw the movie, and then I went and I saw the amazing pictures. There's one picture, we're just talking about Rocky, but in one of the Rockies, Rocky 3, Rocky fought Hulk Hogan, who had a different name, right? Thunderlips, I think it was. And but there's also a big story of wrestling within the Olympic. And there's so many connections between wrestling and boxing, and that's one of the things where one of my favorite pictures that I saw at the exhibit is like Andre the Giant, and he's carrying like 3 boxers, Danny Little Red Lopez, and it's a great picture. So if you watch the documentary, go down to La Plaza de Cultura y Artes in downtown LA, Main Street, and check out the exhibit because it's wonderful. When you go see all those pictures, Steven and Rob's movie, it just comes to life in a different way. So can't recommend that exhibit enough.
Thanks. Yeah, that was it. It was, what was, I think going back to this idea of learning, like it was a whole different, in the making of the film, how the exhibition came about was like, during the process, people kept showing me their stuff. Yeah. And I was just like, wow, this is an artifact. Yeah. This is something that is not, and people would throw that stuff away, or they were shredded or left in moldy basements or whatever. And it was just like, no, this is important cultural history. Yeah. And so it goes back to respect and goes back to like, okay, here's a different way to tell this story. So the film moves like as Rob says, it's a fast-moving, hard-hitting, dramatic, music-driven bit of, visceral history. Yeah. And the exhibition's cool because it allows people to take their time and dig into the artifacts and experience it at their own pace. And that to me was like, as a creator, as a creative person, it's like, it was just a neat thing to be able to do, was because storytelling, you can take, you're talking about short form storytelling, movies, series, all these are just ways of telling a story.
Yeah, that's right.
And so I don't like to say one is better than the other. It's like what mode suits the message you're trying to get across. Yeah. And sometimes that's a physical event, sometimes that's a film, sometimes that's a 10-second clip, sometimes there's so many different ways to tell stories. And I think part of it is just like being creative in envisioning it and not saying, well, I'm setting out to I'm gonna do this because what does the medium, what makes sense for what you're trying to tell? Yeah. And so and fortunately, being able to work with great people like Rob was like, that was so cool to be able to do that. And then with the museum, Gina Aguilera, who was a co-curator with me and super boxing, who's written books about Mexican-American boxing, Latino boxing in LA. Much of this was his collection, and for other people's who he knew. Then wrestling was other collectors and roller derby. There's like these subcultures of people who love the thing that they love. Yeah. And what the ability to kind of like give space for those people to show their collections and show off their stuff in a really nice way, in a respectful way, in a cool, dynamic way, was just another way of kind of telling the story. And the exhibition's up until May of 2024. So I hope people, even if you're not in LA, maybe you come to LA during that time, get a chance to see the exhibition, because it's it's pretty unique, and I don't think anything like it's been done before. So, and yeah, as Rob said, we have all of this other footage. Hopefully we find other ways to make that available to people, whether we're still dreaming of what it can be.
Yeah.
And that's the fun part about this project is, depending on financing or depending on whatever happens, we could spin this out for years.
Yeah.
So that's been a real blessing.
Out of all your footage, what percentage would you say was used in the movie?
God.
Oh God, I don't know how to answer that. I mean, I guess it's like anything. I mean, in the documentary, maybe I don't know. It's like a quarter of it.
Less than that, I would say.
It's sort of like I can't even think of it.
I would say
plethora.
We have a lot of stuff, that didn't make it in, and just like in any film, and so there's a lot of material.
Yeah, there's I mean, probably 5 to 10%.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you have a ton more.
We can do a lot of stuff.
We can do. There's some really beautiful. There's some very poignant, beautiful stuff. There's some really crazy stuff that we couldn't include. Some really crazy stuff, wrestling stuff in particular.
Yeah.
That was wild. My interview with Roddy Piper was insane.
Yeah.
It was just before he passed away, and it was like, oh my God, I've never experienced anything like it.
That's the last interview.
It's the last long form interview that we're aware that he ever did.
Yeah,
and then
he passed away.
He passed away
3 months.
Yeah,
later?
3 months after we interviewed him.
Yeah.
And so, and it was very interesting. So, it's fun.
Yeah, Louis at the beginning of the interview said that he loved the film, but it left him wanting more. Now, I felt,
but it's good.
I felt the same way because now that you talk about all the footage, all the archives, there may be more, and you get that feeling like when you go to a nice restaurant, you get like a 5-course meal or something, and they come in and they tell you, hey, this appetizer is going to cleanse your palate and do all these things, and then they bring in the main course, and then there were so many themes in the movie. All those themes could maybe be their own episode.
Right.
At the beginning of the movie, they were talking about how the mob was involved in boxing before Aileen Eaton came in, and I came across a story of Don Jordan, and I thought about, wow, that could be an episode. And
the Don Jordan story is wild and very interesting, and the mob connections there, and the Mickey Cohen and Frankie Carbo. I mean, there's a fight that we didn't get to talk about. It was the fight that started at the Olympic Auditorium when Don Jordan beat Virgil Akins in 1958. Might be 56. Anyway, somewhere around there. And in those days, the mob controlled certain divisions. And when your fighter won, if you're the manager and you work hard and you get your fighter to the finish line and they win the title, the mob comes and says, "Thank you.
yeah.
He's ours now." Well, they may kick you off a little piece of it, but now he's their fighter.
Yeah.
And he does what they say. And what happened in LA was the manager said no. And that led to a whole series of incidents, a rematch in which Jordan won again, and then firebombings and beatings and a federal case that brought down the mob in boxing. That's its own episode. So there's numerous incredible stories that we couldn't get to because, to go to the food analogy or go to the leave you wanting more, I'm a music guy and I'm, sure, I love Bruce Springsteen, plays a 3-hour set, great. You've left and you're completely sated. It's like eating too much almost though.
Yeah.
I kind of like it when a band comes on and they blow you away and then they don't come back for an encore. Maybe they give you one encore and they're gone. You're like, I want more. And we kind of the film was designed in a way to not to shortchange an audience, but to make them feel like I really I loved it and I wasn't bored at all.
Yeah.
And I wish there was more. And that's, it was part of it was just the way it worked out, and part of it was just,
There's only so much
philosophy.
time.
There's only so much time, and you don't want to bore people. That's going to the point that Rob made earlier. Is younger people, especially, there's a shorter attention spans, and so we designed it. It's the film moves.
And the film really, to your point, flowed beautifully. You mentioned music, and one of my favorite videos to ever watch on YouTube is Queen. They did an amazing set. It was like a short set at Live Aid at Wembley, and it was just like hit after hit after hit, and it wasn't long, but it was just like blown away.
That's one of my favorite live concert videos ever. That's
It's
very special.
Yeah, I love it, and that's kind of how I felt with this movie. It's like, yes, you see the mob, you see Aileen Eaton, you see Don Chargin, but it was just done in a way where the transitions, I love the transition where it was a wrestling and then it goes into the brutality of boxing, and it just flows in such a beautiful way. I'm a boxing guy and I like MMA as well. We're a boxing podcast, right? But I was so captivated by the wrestling stories.
Yeah.
And if you know boxing, you know that Muhammad Ali was influenced by Gorgeous George. So there's connections there. Ronda Rousey, literally her nickname is Rowdy because of Roddy Piper.
Right.
So there's so many beautiful connections there. I was, this may be a silly question, but for the wrestling, I had some wrestling fans that wanted me to ask this. So you have Eddie the Animal Lopez, you have Mando Ramos, and you have Roberto Duran, one corner. And on the other corner, you have Andre the Giant. But it's not a boxing ring, it's a bar. Who would win in a drinking contest between Andre the Giant, Eddie the Animal Lopez, Mando Ramos, or Roberto Duran? Based on your research.
I have to give it to Andre. Andre had capacity, all these other people had incredible, yes, they could consume vast amounts, but Andre was 400 pounds.
Yeah.
So imagine how much it took to get him drunk. We had stories of, the Destroyer, Dick Byer, who's in the movie, who's so wonderful. He was talking about taking a road trip with Andre through the Midwest.
Okay.
Thing that didn't make it into the film. And how it started in the morning, they had to drive, wrestlers had to drive across the country. They had insane, and they just had each other to talk to. Yeah. And these are other things you learn, just this sort of cool stuff about the different sports. So he said, well, we stopped and we got a case of beer and we drove 2 hours, and Andre had gone through the case of beer, 24 beers. Then they stopped and they got another case of beer 2 hours later. Andre had gone through a second case of beer. Then he stopped and got a bottle of vodka, drank an entire bottle of vodka. He could drink a case of champagne. He could drink insane amounts, and he wasn't the only person. This wasn't just, hyperbole. He drank so much, it was, I'm sure it was in some ways to his physical detriment at the end, because he put on a lot of weight over time. He already had a condition that caused him to be so big. All those guys are great. Yeah. Those are great partiers. Eddie the Animal, Mando, and who else did you mention? Roberto Duran. Yeah, all could do it, but Andre, gotta give it to Andre.
Okay, so Andre takes it.
I have to say.
Yeah, when you see a beer can in his hand, you can't even see the beer can. He can legit just hide it with his hand, So yeah, it's not a fair question.
Another question that came in from some of the fans that like wrestling. So we talked about Gene LeBell versus Milo Savage, right? So you have the grappler versus the boxer. Those alpha males, right? In that same auditorium, did they ever kind of challenge each other? Did a wrestler ever say, hey, well, you guys say that boxing is real, right? Or something, wrestling may not, quote unquote, be real, but those guys are the toughest guys out there. Was there ever maybe
yes.
a little, there was? Okay.
Yes, with Gene.
With Gene.
Gene was known, he was sort of the enforcer at the Olympic. He was his mom's sort of muscle to some degree. And when things got out of hand, they had, the Olympic was, another thing I learned along the way is that the Olympic had uniformed LAPD, not just as security, they were uniformed. So somehow Aileen got that. No other venue had armed LAPD in the venue. And there was, there were one story was there was a time when a guy was like supposedly on PCP, broke the teeth of this guy who was one of the main captains of the LAPD, who was at the Olympic all the time, and Gene broke a lot of bones in this guy's body.
Wow.
There was also a time when there was a wrestler, and they also knew Gene had a temper, and you could push Gene's buttons and get Gene to react. And his brother would always goad Gene into fighting people and people challenging Gene, because Gene looked like he wasn't super, like, he's like probably my size, like 5'8", 5'9", maybe, and not super imposing physically, but was in incredible shape and was like a trained, a very highly trained MMA boxer. He learned everything. So there was one time when he had this guy. Gene had him. He was had him by the arm, and he's pulling his arm up and saying, "Say uncle, say uncle." And the guy's like, "No, say uncle, no." Snap. Gene just snapped his arm like a wishbone.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of guy Gene was. You didn't mess with Gene.
Yeah.
Did not mess with Gene. He was a wonderful, great friend. Did not want to be on Gene's bad side, as Steven Seagal found out at some point.
There was a little teaser of that.
Yeah, so Steven Seagal later found out. Look it up on YouTube. Many good stories about that, and supposedly true.
Yeah. So we, Rob, we know your background in music, and we also had some questions come in for you specifically in regards to music and boxing and how sometimes those worlds meet. Very recently, we had a fight in which Bud Crawford came out with a very notable hip-hop artist. What are your thoughts on that walkout? Do you have, what are your thoughts on it?
I thought it was great. I thought it was, it's pretty epic. You know what I mean? It's like, and people keep talking about it, and it's interesting because I had a little insight on that, and I was like, I hope it happens because I've worked with Dr. Dre a bunch of times, and a friend of mine, my friend Rashidi, he's a director. He did Hip Hop Uncovered, and he was like, Dre's likes boxing, and he watches, he was a big Anthony Joshua fan. I don't know if he still is. I know Joshua's had his ups and downs, but hopefully, he's still following him. But he was like, yeah, Dre's going to that fight, and I was like, oh, that's cool. And then when I started seeing the Eminem discussion, I was like, oh, okay, he's probably gonna walk him out, because I was like, if Dre's going, then they're all going. And sure enough, he walked him out, and then it was, I saw somebody else the other day said nobody can use Eminem to walk them out anymore.
Yeah.
So that was great, and I thought it was great. Oh, did you guys say that? Okay, yeah, that was you. See, that was
a mic drop.
So you guys, exactly, you said that, and I think that's definitely valid. And I think, I think it was great for Bud Crawford because all through his career, he wasn't getting as much shine as he should. So when you have like one of the biggest artists ever in the history of music walking you out, pretty impressionable.
So another follow-up question to that. If you had, and this is the multiverse, you can cross any band, any artist, any genre, and any boxer, and you had to curate a walkout, what boxer and what artist would you blend together if you were the curator of that?
I like that question.
What boxer and what artist?
Yeah.
Oh man, that's a tough one. I don't know. I think I don't know if I have the right answer for that, but just off the top, I like that a lot of the Latino fighters. I got into Peso Pluma recently, just as a new artist, and I'm like, the corridos. I wasn't so, like I'm Colombian, so we never got so hard heavy, and we're more into cumbia and vallenato. But like, I like Peso Pluma. I like that whole, little bit of darker, like the, that side. So I don't know. I mean, I don't really have the right answer.
What about Metallica?
Metallica, who would Metallica walk out? I don't know.
Got it. Some of these questions that come in there.
Rob likes so many different. Rob loves music. We both love music. Rob loves music and has such diverse tastes. He's like, where's it going to go with this one?
Right.
Yeah, some of these I think they're great questions. Thank you for asking them.
Yeah,
You need a little bit of time to
Yeah.
digest it and then come through. Yeah.
I feel like this is one of those questions that the answer will come to you like a day or
Yeah,
two.
yeah. I didn't have anything like super powerful, you know. But I wanted to go ahead. I wanted to touch on something that you said, which I want to make sure we talk about in this podcast, which was, and you're recognizing it, some of the parallels that like started at the Olympic that continue on to this day. You know what I mean? And I have my little like spiel, which is, you know, you talked about it earlier with like Gorgeous George. And when people see the film, they'll know about this, but I'm not really giving too much away because it's part of history. It's like, you know, this idea of like being the villain, this idea of like, hey, you're gonna pay to come see me. You know, this is in the lineage of history, in my book anyways, is literally comes from the Olympic Auditorium, and it breaks down like this. You have Gorgeous George first, you know, Gorgeous George, you know, people paid to go, you know, like we want to see this guy lose, like he snubs his, you know, self to the audience, thumbs his nose to the audience and stuff, and then later on you have our Aragon, who Aragon does the same thing, the original Golden Boy, you know, who was, like, as we say in the documentary, was like the biggest, before Oscar De La Hoya, the biggest draw in Los Angeles, you know, for boxing. He does the same thing, you know, he's, you know, people booed him, you know, he sort of was the villain, and then Muhammad Ali comes into the scene. Muhammad Ali, you know, learns, you know, from Aileen Eaton, you'll see that in the documentary, a very important thing, and one of his monikers, and so he does that too. And then you can go through history, and he literally goes to Floyd Mayweather. Floyd Mayweather picks that up, and then we finally end on Conor McGregor, you know? It's the same concept, and all of that starts at the Olympic Auditorium, and when you see the film, you will see what I mean, and I think that that's a really cool part of history that continues on to this day. You know, it literally started in that building.
And it all connects. I mean, you brought up Floyd Mayweather. Floyd Mayweather was literally on the undercard of Carlos El Famoso Hernandez and Chicanito Hernandez at the Olympic.
Yes, so many people have fought there.
Yeah, and we spoke with him. He had wonderful memories about the Olympic.
Carlos Hernandez.
Carlos Hernandez, Carlos El Famoso Hernandez. So I agree with you. Thank you for sharing that with us, because it's something that does build on itself. And there's this big cliche, right? When they say, why do we learn history, right? Well, it's so we don't repeat the same mistakes or something like that. But I think the positive of that is, if you know the history, you appreciate it in a much deeper way. You mentioned driving by the Olympic. I drive by the Olympic every day because I work in downtown, and I go on the 10 freeway. And now when I drive by the Olympic, before, you know, I didn't maybe not notice it as much, but now I have a big smile on my face. I think of Don Chargin, I think of Aileen Eaton, I think of the wonderful memories, and it makes you appreciate history and the city that you live in, wherever you're at a much deeper level.
Yeah, very much.
Yeah, I want to expand on that, because I saw a quote from you when you talked about the movie, where you said it's a way to look at history and use it to understand the complex issues of today. Do you mind expanding on that and what you meant by that?
Yeah, I mean, you guys are right on it. I think that to understand history, and especially popular history, like, you know, like through the Olympic, through sports, it's a way of, number one, interesting people who don't normally think of history. So that it's kind of cool in that way. I've always been interested in all kinds of history, but using sports and popular culture to kind of give a sense that we're, you know, everything that you're experiencing here in life has pretty much been experienced before by your forebears, you know, and there's nothing new under the sun. But in a way that connects you to everyone that's ever existed before. It makes you not, and your problems are not unique. They're part of, like, everyone's experienced those things before. So it makes you feel like more of a human, I think. I mean, I think that's just like, it's a connection of common humanity. Yeah. And to me, like, I see the movie is ultimately a humanist film. It's like, this project is hopefully a way, in this palace of violence, bringing people together. Yeah. Which is the irony of the thing. It's like, this was a place where people hurt each other, and with wrestling, it was theatricalized violence. With boxing, it was you some people, were seriously injured and even died in the ring. All of this was as fun, but I feel like this project is really about everybody, and it's a way to reconnect the bonds of the city, reconnect the neighborhoods and all that stuff.
And I think a lot, like you were touching on it, I forgot, somebody, like a historian or somebody said it, it's sort of like, which is true, you see it a lot. It's like, I grew up in Chicago, but now I've spent half my life in LA, so I really feel like an Angelino now, but when I go to the East Coast or when I go to Chicago, it's like, oh wow, brick, like there's brick buildings, you know what I mean? Like we don't have that, and that's what, more of a mechanical thing because of the earthquakes, but like, it's hard to see the history here sometimes, and we kind of like, somebody said, we whitewash our history, like we stucco over it, there's so many, and so I, as I get older, got more and more into history, and you discover like, wow, there are these parallels, and like for example, one of the cool things about the film is like, we talk about the Zoot Suit riots, you know what I mean? Like, you have a whole movement of younger kids now that are like super into Chicano culture, dressing up in Zoot Suits, you know what I'm saying? Like, the lowrider culture, like when we did our big premiere, at the drive-in, during the pandemic, unfortunately they couldn't make it, but I had like a couple bombs, like
nice.
Hitos were gonna have their cars, you know what I mean? That's part of LA culture, and so there's multi-tier things in there, that I think a younger generation, that's why I think they're gonna be interested in the movie because there's all these parallels to popular culture. One other thing I was gonna say before, so we don't leave it out, is like, again, the contemporary thing is like, we talk about Gene LeBell, Gene LeBell in Tarantino's movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, or is that what the name of it, is the inspiration for Brad Pitt, that's why in our documentary you see that clip with him and Bruce Lee, that's based on him. So these are all real people, and in culture and pop culture you can see these extensions out, continuing from the Olympic Auditorium.
And thank you for crystallizing it that way, because when we wrap up interviews, we like to do something that we call rapid fire. But before I do that, I want to kind of just bring this all together. So this interview started when I went to go see the screening, and I told you the story of my son. And a few days ago, my son came across this viral video. Maybe you've seen it. But there's some gentleman sitting in a bench in New York, and he's just like randomly singing Living on a Prayer. And then the entire park just starts singing when it gets to the chorus, and they start singing Living on a Prayer. And my son is looking at that and says, hey, what song is that? Who sings that? I was like, oh, that's Bon Jovi. That video was shot at the Olympic. It has 1 billion views, and that was shot at the Olympic.
Yes.
So
that's hilarious. I know, it's true. I hadn't seen the viral video, but yes, it's weird. The tentacles of the Olympic, the story never gets boring for me, because it's like, how is it not? There's the weirdest connections to popular culture and to history and all that stuff.
And a lot of things, like I got to see some fights there too, right before it closed. I got to see a few fights in the late 90s, early 2000s, but as a cinematographer, I got to shoot, one of, then they regrouped, but like Rage Against the Machine, I think it was in 2000, like their last shows where, and I got to see Rage Against the Machine do a sound check, and there was like maybe 10 of us in the Olympic Auditorium. Like, I was like, wow, this is amazing. So the people that have passed through there, and and it's crazy. The opening of Raging Bull is when they're coming out is Olympic Auditorium. So it's really special, man.
It is, and there's so many connections. Your film is truly special. We enjoyed it. We want all of our listeners, all of our viewers to watch it. And like Louis said, we're anxiously waiting for more. So when we put it together, hopefully Netflix picks it up, and there's a docuseries of this, because I know the stories can just go on forever.
Well, let me. I'll quickly pimp for the for the Blu-ray, because the Blu-ray has 3 30-minute extra interviews in there. So if you have a Blu-ray player, some people do, some people don't. It's worth it if you want to know more, because there's an extended Gene LeBell interview, Honey Sanchez, and I can't remember who the third person was. But there's 3 extended interviews, and also it looks fantastic on Blu-ray.
And we have it we have it subtitled in Spanish too. So
yeah.
part of even like the Blu-ray for some of our audience, some of the people still have Blu-rays, and people especially for like art movies like ours, there's a big movement. So it is in Spanish as well too, which is
awesome.
Cool. And it's on Amazon. It's streaming on Amazon. You can rent it or buy it on Amazon.
Yeah.
And
go to our website, 18thandgrand.com, has t-shirts and more information about the team and other stuff. And we have social media. All our social media handles are on our website.
And we'll share it on the video
right
as
on.
well.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. So thank you so much for your time. We want to wrap up with the segment we call Rapid Fire. So why don't you kick it away, Lloyd?
So this is our first rapid fire session with 2 guests. So
Yeah.
we're gonna crossfire. Is that what we're gonna do? Or
Yeah, crossfire. Let's do
okay.
that.
So I'm gonna ask Steven. I'll kick it off. Lakers or Clippers?
Lakers.
Oh no, go finish.
Okay, I'm sorry. In-N-Out or Tommy's?
Ooh, Tommy's.
Philippe's or Langer's Deli?
Oh, God. Tie, sorry.
Okay, no, that's good. That's the first.
I love them both.
That's the first time.
I love them both because they're
Lakers.
both so you Lakers.
Okay.
I don't know. Okay, I got it.
Disneyland or Universal Studios?
Disneyland.
Santa Monica or Venice?
Venice.
Cool. All right, you're up, Rob.
Oh boy.
Okay. So, what would you rather own? Some people say this doesn't exist. Some people say it does. Harry Greb's lost film footage of his boxing fights, or the Once Upon a Time Wu-Tang album.
I'm gonna go with the Wu-Tang album.
Okay, cool. Ketchup or no ketchup on a hot dog?
I'm from Chicago, so no ketchup.
Okay, expanding on that. Maybe after a fight or after a concert, what's your go-to meal? Chicago style hot dog or an arepa?
Probably Chicago hot dog. I can't find arepas that easily out here.
Okay, got it. And where's a better place to watch a baseball game? Dodger Stadium or Wrigley Field?
Man. Yeah, I'm gonna say tie. I'm gonna tie.
Tie? Okay, good answer, good answer.
Yeah.
Okay, and Soul Train or Showtime at the Apollo?
Soul Train.
Soul Train.
Yeah. Also born in Chicago.
Got it.
Started in Chicago.
Got it.
Yeah. Don Cornelius.
Awesome.
Is that right? Don Cornelius.
Yeah.
Respect Don Cornelius. Yeah.
Well, thank you for playing Rapid Fire with us.
Okay.
We appreciate it.
Yeah, and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming out and having a conversation with us. I was so excited, prepping for this. I know Carlos was too. I just want to say that I feel that the city of Los Angeles and sports fans and boxing fans around the world are indebted to you guys for telling the story. Thank you so much. I'm probably going to go home and watch this movie again a few more times. And to all our fans and our listeners, do yourself a favor. Please watch the documentary. It's available on Amazon Prime. We'll post all the links to the movie, 18th and Grand, the Olympic Auditorium story. Anything else you guys want to leave us with, gentlemen?
No, it's been really fun.
Yeah,
Thanks
really
a lot,
fun.
guys. Really
Thank you.
great time.
And thank you guys for giving us the platform, and thank you we really appreciate your interest in the film and that you are spreading the word, and thank you again.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you
you.
much.
This has been another installment of Corner to Corner Boxing, where we cover all angles of the sweet science. Thank you.